Largest avatar definitely goes to you.
I don't
Well,
know how
you
big
do.
it is because I can't see myself, which is a little weird.
Well, let me go ahead and introduce you a little bit. So, one of my favorite facts about M is that they make zines, and every time I clean my house, I find some of their zines, which are all awesome and amazing. They're doing their PhD at Abertay right now. In the Did you just graduate? I think you just
Yeah, actually,
graduated.
I finished.
Woohoo! PhD. This is amazing. In the history of displaying video games in museums and other art contexts. They have an academic background, including art history, museum studies, creative writing. But really, they experiment with small game tools in their spare time. They're also interested in creating exhibitions which highlight overlooked elements of the history of artistic practice in games, and developing more experimental approaches to games criticism is also part of what they do. Take it away.
All right. Darshana, could you put the link to my slides in the chat because I am having trouble with the screen sharing. Hi, before we get started, I'd just like to say that if you want to follow along with the slides for this talk, which feature links to a lot of the things that I'm talking about, you can find them on emread.net/game_art_engines.html. So if you put that in, you'll be able to follow this presentation and click on the icons, which are links. I'm really happy to be speaking at this symposium because my research has gotten more interested in game engines and tools. Thanks to Darshana for inviting me. I'd also like to acknowledge some other friends, colleagues, and internet people who played a role in this presentation. Don Miguel, who released the English crack of RPG Maker 20 years ago, Adam Ledoux, the developer of Bitsy, Claire Morwood, who wrote an early tutorial for Bitsy, and Laura, who came up with the concept of flat games, Ebeth and Blake Andrews, who are my co-curators for the Pixels X Paper exhibition, Christy Decker's Low Tech blog, my partner Steven for having an RPG Maker forum teenhood I could pick his brain about, and everyone who makes Bitsy, games, and the culture around it for embodying the best of what I'm about to describe, and also my friend Kendall for their passion for tools, including Domino, which is what I used to make the presentation. In general, my research finds ways to analyze video games through art historical frameworks, as a medium for art, which crosses over with game criticism and game development. In this talk, I'll be describing what I call mass art engines and tools for game making, some interesting qualities they have, and examples of how these qualities work in the Bitsy game engine and what some outcomes are. A description of medium and process is often included in the wall label or discussion of an artwork, but this information can be hidden, sometimes deliberately, in video games. With a few exceptions, we talk about video games as if they are made up of the same stuff. This is partly because the professionalization of the industry has tried to make this process invisible and present the video game as a slick black box toy. When they're invisible, professional tools become norms that are used to define the aesthetics of video games. With increased graphical and technical complexity, game engines became guarded proprietary technology. Occasionally, studios would offer limited versions to make mods or extra levels, but these were usually subservient to the existing game. If there was enough community interest and work to make a completely different way of playing, it was difficult to distribute outside of the existing ecosystem. When new tools for game making became accessible outside of this, what people made can be quite different from what professional game developers make. Elements of the process are often more visible. If you can name the engine a game uses, that can be an evaluation of its quality. Describing something as a Flash game, an RPG Maker game, a Unity horror game, is not always a compliment and never an unqualified one. At best, the implication is that the game almost conceals its process or makes up for it, but is never fully successful in its own right. This differs from how tools and processes are understood in our historical perspective. These details are vital elements of provenance and can be a source of important details about the artist or how to preserve the artwork. Indie games only really became possible through there being more tools and opportunities to make and distribute video games. People had always been doing their own hobbyist or amateur programming. The emergence of indie as a classification was not something outside of corporate centralization, but working alongside it. So this connects to language like democratization and supporting the indie community that tools could promote themselves with, or how storefronts discuss independent titles. How democratic are the things these tools and platforms actually do? Funding a few projects selected to be featured on their closed or rent-seeking platforms, becoming an industry standard or ubiquitous enough that they are what everyone ends up being ushered towards, These are capitalist-oriented views of community which indicate captive users to extract value from in the form of rents, royalties, content, demographic info, rather than people choosing to work together for collective benefit. So in that context, something successfully becoming a mass art tool is a threat, and is met with concerns about quality or dismissed as shovelware or not real games. Even self-consciously retro indies often do this sort of policing but use different ideas of quality and legitimacy than the mainstream industry. We become entrenched in a capitalist scarcity mindset when we get protective over who really makes games, what games really look like, and what tools make real games. From that perspective, the best we can hope for is that the right games, whatever that means, get the publisher deals and privileged placement on storefronts. I'd rather see it as a huge opportunity that there are so many games and so many ways of making them. We have to rise to meet the ways that people are relating to video games and using game tools to stay relevant. I think to call tools that embody this attitude accessible or easy or indie homogenizes them. Instead, I call them mass art tools. I use mass art not to describe work that is made and distributed at scale or just popular or well advertised, but in the sense that Susan Sontag uses it. She observed in the 1970s that photography has become almost as widely practiced as an amusement as sex or dancing, which means that, like every other mass art form, photography is not practiced by most people as an art. Mass game making would mean many people using these tools, and they're not using them as a game developer or a member of the game industry, even aspirationally. It may seem a bit utopian given the squeeze on arts funding in general and the power of for-profit platforms in gaming, but I think we have to consider this type of production worthy and exciting in itself, not as a pool to pick out sleeper hits or game design students from. I always work envisioning an idea of a culture where this work is sustainable, uplifted, and has a critical dialogue around it. So here are some important qualities of mass art tools. A distinct starting point. This is what we currently focus on when deciding if something is accessible or not, beyond if it's publicly distributed or free. Is the interface that opens legible? Is it clear what the first things you should do are? This plays a role in the success of applications, which provide icons and drag and drop menus and allow you to place elements visually. It's a good first step, but not the most important, nor does it ensure it is sustainable in the long run. What can we learn from piracy? Piracy is resilient, creative, and accessible, usually much more so than the gaming companies that try to shut it down. It is context that has enabled the preservation of games history and the development of new ways to play that the industry neglects. Piracy is also linked to translation patching. Don Miguel's English release of RPG Maker distributed a Japanese-only product around the world. The series is now released officially in multiple languages, but the idiosyncratic and illicitly distributed English crack did the most to shape the international RPG Maker community. Originating in an act of piracy contributed to its magpie nature, creating games with ripped sprites and licensed music. Piracy is where we can see what barriers to distribution, preservation, and usability people are struggling with and build for them instead. Do people really own the tool and what it puts out? Forms of online-only or rent-based access don't only monitor and control users' access and more aggressively extract value, they're also environmentally inefficient compared to downloading or installing a piece of software, one that simply works offline on your computer and saves your work as a local file. Streaming platforms also have a really poor memory. Things appear and disappear from them in increasingly opaque ways. If there's a platform that mediates your access to a game file, unless you have an offline version or way to simulate that platform, you can't say it's preserved. Always online and auto-updating apps and social media sites leave users behind unless they can afford to constantly upgrade. In a practical sense, we need to start refurbishing and extending the life of our existing technology while using less resources and energy. But also, if your project doesn't work on a several years old laptop, you're excluding a lot of people from your audience right off the bat. File size is also important. Mainstream games can now be in the tens or hundreds of gigabytes, and this growth is unsustainable and for diminishing returns. The files are annoyingly huge to download with a decent internet connection, but they're also super inaccessible. Capitalist fast internet is far from the norm around the world. Similarly, ease of use and recognition of the files it puts out matters. Can you make a distributable exe file, or something that has to be zipped up or played through a specific interface? The more steps it takes for a computer to open and run, the more places something can go wrong or daunt a novice user. Formats that enable community upkeep are also valuable for the long-term life of a project. The output of many creativity tools are hosted or usable only as long as the service is active or profitable. and it means tons of work is locked away or lost. Rather than being tied to a specific product lifecycle, files that can be stored in homepages or community databases have a much better chance of sticking around. Finally, there has to be a place for everyone to share. Philomela was an enormous part of why Twine took off, just as much as its HTML-based format and visual interface. itch.io has been a general-purpose place where many games can be uploaded and both downloaded and run in browser. These platforms should be as open as possible in terms of what they take. Bitsy is a game engine that does a lot of these things and interests me a lot. It is a personal project by Adam Ladeau, though now hundreds of people use it. Bitsy started out as a way to work on games with a notes app while on the bus home from work. There's now an online JavaScript-based interface which outputs text files, which work in the same way as this early text-only development, and HTML files where the game is interpreted and then run in browser. Bitsy references older formats than the qualities of digital media itself. The pixels in each 8x8 tile are defined as binary zeros and ones, and the items you can interact with are a different color than static tiles. This gives each 8x8 tile room a 3-color palette. This may seem restrictive or destined to kind of always look like Bitsy from a professionalized game design perspective. In practice, however, there are over 2,000 Bitsy games posted to itch.io. This has led to a community around Bitsy games, which creates a context for appreciating the Bitsiness of their production and the particulars of working with the tool. This has led to a culture that is self-directed, which shares and pools resources and builds on others' work, and is not doing this in the context of a proprietary modding or user-generated content context. Bitsy provides an intuitive interface that produces lightweight and legible files that have existing distribution channels under a Creative Commons license, so making things like mods and hacks are both technologically straightforward and explicitly condoned. This means there are straightforward ways to combine or troubleshoot Bitsy games from the text files. Additionally, when you open the editor, there's an avatar, a room, a cup of tea item, and a cat already placed, so you have a small demo that conveys how you move around and how you interact with objects. The only potential problem is that Bitsy is still mostly online in terms of how people use it and access the games. A standalone editor and way to package Bitsy games would be ideal, but there are community workarounds. So there's a lot of interesting results of these open and low-tech qualities in a game engine, and Bitsy is where we can see some examples. Bitsy collections have been included in several game festivals and exhibitions, with custom hardware like the Bitsy Boutique, or with tools that allow multiple games to be presented in the same Bitsy page. Because Bitsy games are text or HTML files, they're easy for existing archival organizations like the British Library to incorporate into their interactive fiction collections. Transparent game data means writing directly into the game data or creating tools that automate these hacks is a common way to add capabilities not included in the editor. Making and sharing hacks is a common way that Bitsy developers help each other and work together on projects. Borksy is a really great and commonly used example of a tool which automates adding several different hacks to any project. This leads to the formal development of the engine building on accessibility rather than complexity. Bitsy is available in 17 languages, but has retained its original look and workflow, and hasn't expanded features in a way that makes user-developed hacks redundant. This prioritizes changes that allow more people to use Bitsy while still maintaining its legible interface. It also makes the development of the engine more distributed than hierarchical. And finally, there's a lot of shitposting in Bitsy. Rather than seeing this as spam or insincere or low-quality work, games like this are evidence an engine is being used casually and for communication. The structure and aesthetics of Bitsy also inform projects by and for the community that use it, like the video sharing space Zone. So to conclude, I hope this provided some insight into game tools' mass potential, in addition to what they let tech-savvy game designers and artists do. Making tools that have this potential means fighting pressure towards professionalization, polish, and scale that cause tools like Unity to become standard. With Unity's recent IPO, who knows what the future will look like in terms of accessibility and conservation of work made within Unity. The game industry cares about video games being called art, and I think artists and independent practitioners do too. It's still hard and awkward to talk about video games as art because we've inherited so many anti-art assumptions from the tech industry. Often discussions revolve around a particular idea of how to make video games or what the proper uses of the medium are at the time. It may involve work that doesn't seem like video games, or worse, seems like bad video games, but considering this work can help shift the discussion around games towards one that values process and variety. It's already been said many times, but worries about accessible tools and storefronts leading to too many games are overblown. It should be equally as ridiculous as saying there's too much art because so many people can pick up a digital camera or pencil and paper. Thank you.